Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is the Chief Executive Officer of the Indigenous Screen Office, Kerry Swanson. The goal of the ISO is to champion Indigenous screen-based storytellers and narrative sovereignty in Canada through funding and advocacy work. Supporting Indigenous companies, communities, and individuals share their stories and perspectives across all screen platforms. Kerry was born and raised in Chapleau, Northern Ontario, in a Cree, Ojibwe, Irish, and French family. She is a member of Micho-Picotin First Nation with familial ties to Chapleau Cree First Nation. Kerry, awesome to have you in studio with us here.
Thanks for having me.
We kind of laid out what the ISO is, but for those who are unfamiliar with the Indigenous Screen Office, can you talk about what it is and its goals?
Yeah, the Indigenous Screen Office is a national funding body and advocacy organization for the Indigenous screen sector. So we fund Indigenous-made content on all screen platforms across the country.
And so it was created in 2017. I think you've been around with the ISO since like 2018 at least,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Was there something in particular at that time, back in 2017, that led to the creation or the need for the ISO?
Yeah, there was, absolutely. I mean, I have been working in the Indigenous arts and culture sector. I got my start 20 years ago at the Imaginative Film Festival, and we've been advocating for much longer than that time for Indigenous specific funding for the sector, and it just wasn't happening quickly enough. And what we saw was that producers who were non-Indigenous were accessing large amounts of funding to tell Indigenous stories, while Indigenous filmmakers and producers were not able to access that kind of funding to tell their stories.
Any examples of those projects back then?
I think you have some examples, Dennis.
Well, I mean, when you look at the movies that came out in 2017, there was Indian Horse and the documentary Rumble, both pretty well received. And then there was Wind River, a film that was, written by a non-Indigenous person. It's received quite a bit of criticism over the years. I guess, how would you describe the Indigenous content on screens back in 2017?
Back at that time, well, the films that you mentioned were not Indigenous made. They weren't owned, controlled, and directed by Indigenous people. So if you look, an example I like to give is Tenarjuat, The Fast Runner, right. Made over 20 years ago, 25 years ago now, is constantly cited as one of the most successful Canadian films. Critically, it won the Camera d'Or, a major prize at Cannes Film Festival. It was internationally renowned and continues to be cited as one of the best Canadian films of all time. Written and directed by Zacharias Canuck in the Inuktitut language and filmed up north in Nunavut. That movie should have triggered a flood of funding for Indigenous-made content. And the question we ask, is why didn't it? Right. We've been advocating since that time to have this kind of recognition and funding for what is recognized as being unique and internationally recognized content, and it didn't happen. And so really, that's why we needed an organization like the ISO to really make that push.
20 years ago, that's crazy. As soon as you say the name, I can picture the cover of it, where he's wearing the glasses and stuff.
It's an iconic film.
Yeah, for sure. How would you describe the landscape now in 2024?
Yes, I think I'm happy to say, and I think we've all noticed on our screens, that things are changing. We've got the Canadian Screen Awards coming up, and Little Bird, an APTN CBC show that is sweeping the awards. And so we're really excited. We supported mentorship and training on that production, and we've got a number of feature film projects, Twice Colonized, Hey Victor, up for feature film and documentary awards. So there's certainly a change. We're seeing it on our screens, And we're certainly seeing a huge number and volumes of applications increasing year on year. So we've got no shortage of Indigenous talent out there wanting to make work on screens.
All right. Love Hey Victor. Next week, Cody Lightning will be on this very show. We'll be talking about Hey Victor and much more. So the ISO, like you say there, funds a number of different things. There's the Story Fund, things like training, travel. Can you walk us through some of those and how they can help Indigenous creators?
Yeah, absolutely. So our Story Fund is really focused on the creation. So we fund development, and it's important for especially emerging creators to know that they can apply for funding even when their project is at that earlier idea stage and they want to work on a script or they want to really work on their idea before getting to that next phase, which is production. We fund production as well as we have post-production funding. And we are different than a lot of the other funders in the broadcasting sector in that we fund sector development. So we fund capacity building and training initiatives as well through our sector development program. And the third area that we're funding more recently is digital, immersive, and podcasts. And so we're really excited about that. Again, podcasting has become a really important part of the landscape of the screen-based ecosystem, and not a lot of funders are actually supporting podcasts. So we partnered with google.org and got a fund going and just recently announced 12 recipients of funding in that program.
Really exciting stuff too. What are some of the other projects? You mentioned Little Bird, Hey Victor, that the ISO has helped fund or helped train over its 6 years or so.
Over 6 years, one of the ones I'm really proud of is we supported a number of award-winning films during COVID. One of them was Night Raiders by Dennis Goulet. Did really well at the box office and was a really incredible sci-fi genre film that really tackles the stories of residential school in a really powerful way.
Also had Dennis on the show. When I think about it right now, like we had Jeff Barnaby and Dennis and Cody Lightning and so many of our guests actually, maybe those projects might not have happened if not for support of the ISO.
Yes, certainly. Like I said, we have all been advocating together for this funding and for the existence of the ISO. Dennis Goulet was certainly a very important advocate of the ISO. And so, we really all have been working towards this together, and it feels like all of the pieces are starting to fall into place more recently.
Well, we're going to get into funding in a bit here, but in terms of applicants, do you have any idea how many people have benefited from ISO, and are there people that you have to obviously, I guess, turn away?
Yes, there's always, unfortunately, those who are not successful. We fund approximately 150 projects a year, which is, it's a pretty high number. We only have 13 million a year. I say only because it's not enough to achieve the full scope of our mandate, and obviously the requests that we get are much higher than that. So we do our best. Our maximum grant is still only 500,000. So for production, in the production story fund. So it's not enough to really make the impact that we need to make into the future. And so that's the future for us, is continuing to advocate for more funding for these projects.
All right. I don't know if you were able to say or no, but 500,000, what's a project like 6 episodes of Little Bird? What would that even cost?
Well, usually a series is, I don't know their budget, but for an episodic series, you're looking at 1 or 2 million per episode. Right. As on the small budget side. So as I said, we need to be able to increase those numbers in terms of our funding. And for a feature film, I think what we're seeing now, and this is a great thing, is that Indigenous made films are being funded at the higher levels. So we're now seeing Night Raiders was the largest budget feature film at that time, and it was $8 million. So you can see that $500 in a budget that size, $500,000 isn't going to make the kind of impact that we want to as we get into those much larger productions. And as the talent grows, as the industry responds to the content, that's where we need to go.
For sure. Much more to talk about here, Kerry, on Face to Face. We just have to step aside for a quick break, but there's more to come. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the CEO of the Indigenous Screen Office, Kerry Swanson. Kerry, before the break, we were talking about some of the projects the ISO has helped fund over the years. One of the big things lately is the $1 million that the ISO committed to the creation of Iqaluit's first large-scale film and television production studio. Can you tell us about that project and the hopes for it?
Yeah, it's such a great example of the kind of impact the ISO can make. We were the first in-funder for a studio spearheaded by Red Marrow, a production company led by two Inuk women living up in Iqaluit and making their work up there. And so our funding of $1 million has actually triggered $3 million in Nunavut and federal funding to support a fully funded studio. So not only the construction of the studio, but actually equipment is going to be fully equipped. And this is going to leave an economic legacy in the community. It was originally tied to the project North of North, which is shooting up there now, but it's going to be a long-term investment in the community. So we're really excited about that.
Can you tell us a bit about North of North?
Yeah, this is a first ever Netflix Indigenous Canadian project, also supported by APTN and CBC. And it's a 30-minute sitcom based up in Iqaluit. And I think that the impetus of having the possibility of the studio up north allowed them to actually shoot in Iqaluit. It's very expensive to shoot up there, and I think that they were going to possibly have to shoot in the south, in Ontario, if it hadn't have been for the possibility of having this studio there. So we're really excited to be the catalyst for that kind of economic impact and change.
And I guess, you know, not just for this production, but for future productions and really building up an industry up there, perhaps. Yeah,
exactly. That's what we're all about. We're not just funding projects, we're building an Indigenous screen sector in Canada, and we're really seeing the ripple effect is that it's inspiring people across borders as well, and they're looking at our model and saying, hey, maybe we can do that here too.
Nice. You know, the media landscape has no doubt been changing so much in recent years, whether it's the impact of streaming and social media or government legislation, which one of those things is Bill C-11. Can you tell us about that bill and what the hopes are for Indigenous content?
Yeah, it's actually, you know, the bill is called the Online Streaming Act, and I think something that has been lost in all of the media coverage is the opportunity that this change in legislation offers to the Indigenous screen sector. So it's the first time that the Broadcasting Act has been renewed in a couple of decades at least, and the language in the Broadcasting Act used to say that Indigenous content should be supported if resources become available. And that if resources become available meant that, you know, we were underfunded, as we've been talking about. Those resources somehow just never became available. And so this change in the Act is now rippling down into other legislative processes, including the Bill C-11 CRTC process. And so we were at the hearing. We were recently certified as an independent production fund, which gives us the opportunity to have some of the funding that is reallocated through this process. So that's a great opportunity for all of us.
Well, we hear and talk a lot about narrative sovereignty. Wondering what that means for you.
For us at the ISO, narrative sovereignty means Indigenous stories made, told, owned, and controlled by Indigenous people. So that is really our mandate, is to support narrative sovereignty for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across Canada. That doesn't mean we don't want to partner with other producers and other organizations and companies, but it really means on our terms that, that the storytelling is controlled by the people whose stories those are.
Right. So Inconvenient Indian, have to bring up, but directed by Michelle Latimer, comes out in 2020 amid questions about Latimer's indigeneity at the time, and gets pulled from the festival circuit shortly thereafter. The ISO, following that, the ISO and APTN commissioned a report that came out. It was called Building Trust and Accountability. Can you talk about why there was, I guess for starters, the need for a study like that?
Yeah, so part of our mandate and one of our values at the ISO is to be responsive. And so what we were hearing at that time from community members was that we needed to play a role in stepping up to the plate and figuring out which kinds of policies we needed to put in place to prevent this from happening. So the Building Trust and Accountability report was really just a starting point for that process. Since that time, we've put in place very rigorous policies and practices, and we publish those in detail every year on our website. And so you can actually see what questions we ask, what our process is for vetting eligibility of our applicants to ensure that our funding is going to Indigenous applicants.
We know identity can be a very tricky thing, a very emotional thing. The report suggested ways that funding agencies could rule out these, weed out these false claims of Indigenous identity. Can you talk about, I guess, some of those methods that you have in place?
Yeah, for us, our method is relational. So we really, just as we do in person, introduce one another and tell each other who we are and where we come from and who our families are, or what our story is. We understand people are disconnected in many cases, but we want to know who our applicants are because we're entering into a relationship with them as a funder. And so we take that approach. We ask questions. Tell us your story. Tell us who you are. Where are you from? What communities are you affiliated with? And that's the starting off point. We leave a lot of space for that. And we also have questions woven into the application process in terms of if a project has a community engagement plan, or what the process is if people are telling stories from communities that are not their own, for example. So we've kind of woven it into our entire process. And again, it's very transparent. Anyone can see how we're assessing that and how we're looking at that.
Like we said off the top there, around when the ISO was created, there was a lot of non-Indigenous people telling Indigenous stories. Are we seeing a lot less of that now?
I think so. We do often get people coming to us who have a story and they want a recommendation for a director or producer. We're really clear that that's not what we do. We're here to support Indigenous storytellers in telling their stories. So I think it's still out there, but the difference is that it's really about where the funding is directed. And so I think that's the big shift that we're seeing, is that, someone is welcome to tell a story, but they are not eligible for getting funding, public dollars, to tell that story in this case.
For sure. Kerry, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for one last quick break, but stick around. There's more face-to-face to come. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kerry Swanson, the CEO of the Indigenous Screen Office. And Kerry, it's only been a few weeks now since stable, ongoing funding was announced for the Indigenous Screen Office, $13 million a year. What's that going to mean for the ISO?
It's so exciting for us because it means a stable foundation. Prior to this, we only had a 3-year commitment for the government, and it ran out just a month before the latest announcement. So it's really not viable to exist in that kind of precarity, and now we have a strong foundation, and we can build and we can grow from here.
The ISO, of course, not just reliant on the government or government funding. You have a lot of partners. Can you talk about what those partnerships mean for the projects that are getting done?
Yeah, we do, and we'll continue to grow our partnerships, and now we have more time to do that because we don't have to continue focusing on renewing this funding, right. But we partner with APTN and CBC on a pre-development program where we place content creators in the pre-development stream to kind of fast track the process. We recently, I mentioned, we partnered with Google.org to create a whole new stream of funding in digital and podcasting. So our partnerships are pretty broad. We also fund a lot of partnerships in training and mentorship through our sector development program. So we partner with Telefilm, with Canada Media Fund on our international market development strategy. And so that allows us to represent Indigenous Canada where Canada is being presented in the international context.
We've talked about some of the past successes, whether it be Little Bird or Night Raiders. Any projects coming up that the ISO is involved in that you're excited about?
Well, I'm really excited about North of North.
Right.
I think we're all excited about that. They're shooting right now in Iqaluit, so we're super excited about that. We also have the Indigenous Screen Summit coming up at the Banff World Media Festival. This is another partnership program that we do. We have 14 storytellers pitching their projects in Banff, and it's a really exciting, vibrant, it's packed out every year. The room is full, it's full of energy, and people are really looking forward to that.
And you were mentioning Hot Docs too, a couple of exciting films going to be there as well.
Yeah, so we actually have 3 feature films showing at Hot Docs that were funded by the ISO. Singing Back the Buffalo, which is about the repatriation of the buffalo here on the prairies. Yinta, which is about the Wet'suwet'en protests, pipeline protests. And Wilfred Buck, about the amazing Cree star knowledge keeper, Wilfred, who I heard you'll have on here soon with the filmmaker Lisa Jackson.
Absolutely, and we'll have something on Yinta later for you as well. I guess just to kind of wrap up here, Kerry, what would be your vision for the ISO and for Indigenous content on our screens in 5-10 years?
Yeah, just more of what we're seeing, bigger budget projects, and we really want to see our content recognized and celebrated and watched across Canada and around the world.
Nice. Well, it's been a great couple of years, the last few for sure, for projects on the screen. Kerry, thanks so much for the work you do and for being with us this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is all the time we have for the show this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. You'll also find this show and past episodes as a podcast there as well. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you back here in 7 days.